Evelyn had always believed that love, when built on a solid foundation, could weather any storm. She and Jake had been together for nearly a decade, partners in every sense of the word. Their life was comfortable, predictable, and safe. They shared responsibilities, planned for the future, and navigated the daily routines of marriage with practiced ease. But lately, Evelyn had started to feel something unsettling. A quiet, creeping sense of emptiness that she couldn't quite explain. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly between them had dwindled into brief exchanges about schedules and bills. Date nights were now just quiet dinners in front of the television, with Jake half distracted by work emails and Evelyn scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone. It wasn't that Jake was unkind or neglectful, he was a good man. A provider, responsible and steady, but somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing each other. The warmth, the excitement, the intimacy that once made their relationship feel electric had faded into something resembling polite companionship. And though Evelyn told herself that this was just the natural rhythm of long-term love, she couldn't ignore the restlessness growing inside her. It whispered in the quiet moments, "Is this really enough?" The shift in Evelyn's life came subtly, like the slow turning of a season. It wasn't an explosion, not some dramatic revelation, but rather a quiet unraveling, a moment that seemed insignificant until it wasn't. It started the night of Jake's company barbecue, a gathering she had almost skipped. Exhausted by the monotony of their routine, she had forced herself to go, to stand by Jake's side, smiling at his colleagues, listening to their endless conversations about quarterly reports and market trends. And then, in the middle of it all, she heard a laugh, rich, familiar, unmistakable. Lucas. He had been Jake's closest friend in college, a man who had once been a constant presence in their early years together. He had moved away for work, built a life in another city, and for a long time, had been nothing more than a passing thought, a memory from a different chapter of her life. But now, here he was, standing a few feet away. The same easy confidence, the same mischievous glint in his eyes. When their gazes met, something flickered in her chest, something warm, something she hadn't felt in a long time. And just like that, the season began to change. Evelyn didn't seek out Lucas, not at first, but life had a way of pulling certain people back into your orbit, whether you were ready for it or not. It started innocently, a friendly catch-up at the barbecue, both of them laughing at how time had slipped through their fingers, how they had once spent nights debating the meaning of life over cheap wine and now worried about mortgage rates and meal prepping. Then came the coffee invite, a casual, offhanded suggestion from Lucas as she gathered her things to leave. "It's just coffee," he had said with an easy grin. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she said yes. One coffee turned into two, then into long, meandering conversations where Evelyn felt like she could breathe again. Lucas had always been good at that, making her feel seen, making her feel like more than just Jake's wife, more than just the woman who kept their home running smoothly while Jake buried himself in work. With Lucas, there was no talk of responsibilities or to-do lists, no quiet resentment simmering beneath the surface. There was only laughter, effortless conversations, and a spark she had long since convinced herself was lost forever. Evelyn told herself it was harmless. A coffee here, a conversation there. It wasn't like she was doing anything wrong, at least. Nothing she could put a name to. But deep down, she knew. She felt it in the way her heartbeat quickened when Lucas texted, in the way she checked her reflection before meeting him, in the way she replayed their conversations long after she returned home to Jake. It wasn't just about Lucas. It was about how she felt when she was with him, alive, untethered, like a version of herself she had nearly forgotten. Then came the lies, small ones. At first, "I ran into an old friend and grabbed a coffee." True, just not the whole truth. "I stayed late at the bookstore." Also true, but not the reason for her absence. The ease with which the words slipped from her lips unsettled her. Yet she justified it. It wasn't an affair, not in the way people whispered about affairs. There were no stolen kisses, no tangled sheets, but there was something just as dangerous, an intimacy, an emotional pull that made her feel weightless and reckless all at once. And deep down, she knew she was teetering on the edge of something she might never come back from. Evelyn had always been good at keeping things compartmentalized, neatly stacking her emotions where they belonged, until now. The more time she spent with Lucas, the more blurred the lines became. She found herself reaching for her phone at odd hours, fingers hovering over his name, craving the connection, the rush of excitement that had become as intoxicating as it was dangerous. And yet, every time she stepped through the front door of the home she shared with Jake, reality slammed into her like a tidal wave, drenching her in guilt. She told herself she could stop anytime, that she could pull back, retreat before she crossed a line she couldn't undo. But the truth was, she didn't want to. Lucas saw her in a way she hadn't been seen in years. Made her feel something she hadn't realized she was missing. It wasn't just about him, it was about her. The woman she used to be before routines and responsibilities dulled her edges. But even as she convinced herself she had control, Jake started to notice the distracted glances, the absent-minded responses, the way she pulled away from his touch. And the worst part? A small, selfish part of her didn't care. Evelyn sat in the dim light of their living room, her fingers wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of tea she had no intention of drinking. Across from her, Jake scrolled absent-mindedly through his phone, his brow furrowing every so often as if something wasn't quite sitting right with him. The weight of her secret pressed down on her chest, tightening like a vice. She had never been a liar, never been the kind of woman to hide things from her husband. But here she was, living a double life, balancing between the safe predictability of her marriage and the reckless thrill of Lucas. The guilt came in waves, unpredictable and suffocating. She could still feel the ghost of Lucas's touch from their last meeting. The way his fingers had brushed hers just a second too long, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. She had promised herself it wouldn't go further, but even she didn't believe that anymore. Jake suddenly looked up, his gaze locking onto hers. "You okay?" he asked, his voice laced with something she couldn't quite place: concern, suspicion, or maybe just the distant remnants of trust. And for the first time, she wasn't sure how to answer. The night air was thick with the scent of rain, the pavement slick beneath Evelyn's hurried steps as she made her way toward the familiar cafe. Her heart pounded not from the cool evening chill, but from the anticipation curling inside her like a tightly wound spring. She knew she shouldn't be here, knew that every stolen moment with Lucas was another thread unraveling the life she had built with Jake. And yet, she couldn't stop herself. When she stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe wrapped around her, a sharp contrast to the turmoil inside her. Lucas was already waiting, leaning back in his chair, his sharp blue eyes watching her every move. As she slid into the seat across from him, he smirked, as if reading her thoughts. "You came." Evelyn swallowed, her throat dry. "I shouldn't have." Lucas tilted his head. "Then why did you?" She had no answer, at least, not one she was willing to say out loud. Because the truth was terrifying, she felt alive with him, in a way she hadn't in years. And that realization was more dangerous than any lie she had told Jake. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat of her car, gripping the steering wheel long after she had turned off the engine. The weight of what she was about to do settled over her like a storm cloud, pressing down on her chest. Through the rain-speckled windshield, she could see Lucas waiting inside the dimly lit cafe, his silhouette a stark contrast against the warm glow behind him. She could turn around now, go home, pretend none of this ever happened. But pretending wouldn't erase the truth. With a deep breath, she stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. As she pushed open the cafe door, Lucas's eyes lifted to meet hers, a slow smile curving his lips. It sent a shiver through her, not from fear, but from something more dangerous, something intoxicating. "You look like you've made a decision," he murmured as she slid into the seat across from him. Evelyn exhaled shakily. "I have." Lucas leaned in, his voice low. "And?" She hesitated, the battle raging inside her louder than ever. But deep down, she already knew. The real question wasn't whether she would cross the line, it was whether she had ever truly stayed behind it. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the neatly packed suitcase in the corner of the room. It was small, just enough for a few nights, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she replayed the conversation with Jake over and over in her mind, the hurt in his eyes, the disbelief in his voice. "Is there someone else?" he had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She had hesitated for too long, That silence had answered him before she ever could. Now, in the quiet of their home, guilt wrapped around her like a vice. She wanted to believe she was doing the right thing, that stepping away would clear the fog clouding her mind, that maybe, just maybe, she could figure out what she truly wanted. But the truth gnawed at her. If she had to leave to find clarity, hadn't she already made her choice? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Lucas. She closed her eyes, breathing through the whirlwind of emotions inside her. One step forward, and there would be no turning back. And yet, as she reached for the handle of her suitcase, her fingers didn't hesitate. The evening air was crisp as Evelyn sat across from Jake at their favorite cafe. The same place where, years ago, they had first talked about building a life together. Now, it felt like a fragile relic of what they once were. The weight of her choices still pressed against her, but the exhaustion of guilt had faded. In its place, a quiet understanding had settled. Jake stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his eyes fixed on the swirling liquid rather than on her. So, he finally said, voice steady but distant, "Do you regret it?" Evelyn exhaled, considering his question. Regret. It was a complicated thing. She regretted the pain she had caused him, the deception, the nights of sleepless turmoil. But she couldn't regret waking up to the truth that she had been lost long before Lucas ever stepped into her life. "I regret hurting you," she admitted, her voice soft, "but I don't regret learning who I am." Jake's lips pressed into a thin line before he nodded. At least that's something. They sat in silence, neither rushing to fill it. Maybe this was closure, not grand or dramatic, but a quiet acceptance that sometimes love isn't enough and that life, somehow, still moves forward. Life is full of crossroads, and sometimes, the most painful choices lead to the most profound growth. Evelyn's story is a reminder that honesty with yourself and those you love is essential. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to lose yourself in routines, expectations, and unspoken emotions. If you feel disconnected from your life, take a step back and reflect on what truly makes you happy. Avoid seeking validation in temporary escapes and instead, confront the root of your restlessness: communication, self-awareness, and courage to make the right decisions, whether that means rebuilding or letting go, or key to living authentically.